Merry Christmas, and today we are going to talk about the birth of Jesus. So most people have one or two beliefs. One, they believe Christmas, the birth of Jesus actually happened on December 25th. And then the other group believes that, well, he was not actually born on December 25th. And the reason why we use December 25th is because of a bunch of pagan festivals that Christians wanted to take over. Both views are incorrect, and this video is going to be about why those are incorrect. Starting with the traditional dating of December 25th. So why didn't God just be like, okay, I was born, let's say October 1st, which we'll get to in the rest of the video. But why didn't you just say that? Well, there's lots of times in the Bible that God specifically does something in secret, and it's to show his own glory. So if we look at Proverbs 25, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, and it is the glory of kings to search it out. So God seems to have this idea that there are times where he will deliberately conceal something so that whenever we dig into it and see the revelation of what it was supposed to be, it can glorify God in a much greater way. One of the most obvious examples of this is the prophets. All these prophecies, whenever they're being fulfilled, even if they're fulfilled hundreds of years later, you can look into it and be like, oh wow, this is amazing, including all the stuff about Jesus, which is really what the majority of my channel is going to be about. So when it comes to Christmas, this similar thing is happening. Why didn't God just have a very explicit day? Hey, this is the exact day I was born as a man in this world. He didn't. But he did give us all the information we need to search it out and to discover it. That's what we're going to be doing in this video today. And let's first tackle the original dating of Christmas. Where did it come from? The earliest church fathers, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Origen, they all viewed birthday celebrations as pagan. They didn't want to practice it. So for the first several hundreds years of Christianity, we didn't practice Christmas. No one celebrated the birth of Jesus. It wasn't until 336 AD that we actually started celebrating Christmas. Whenever the Catholic Roman Church started celebrating Christmas, it was in the 300s. So for the first 300 years, no one celebrated it, and the church fathers who spoke about it thought it was pagan to celebrate it. Now you can take that and run with it, and in a way, birthdays are pagan, but Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, so maybe it's not that bad to celebrate man-made traditions, including things like birthdays. So the earliest writing we have on the birth of Jesus from Christian sources comes from Clement of Alexandria in around 200 AD. So this is around 140 years before we actually started celebrating Christmas. And in his writings, he said that many church fathers had tried to deduce the date of Christmas, and they came up with wildly different days. So, some people said it was the 20th of May of the 28th year of Augustus. Others thought it was the 16th year of Tiberius. So we have a years difference between those two events on March 21st. So we have May 20th, March 21st, April 15th, April 20th, and April 21st. So we have a wide range of possible days that church fathers were giving in the first 3 generations of Christians on when Jesus was actually born. And none of them were celebrated as the birth of Christ. You have to wait until way later that people actually start recognizing, oh, this is maybe the day, it was tradition to hold that this was the day Jesus was born. The first celebration of Christmas was on 336 AD, as I said. That was done in Rome. In the Armenian church, it was actually done on January 6th, which is where we get the 12 days of Christmas, which is fun. So even within the early Christianity, there was no agreement on December 25th. So you have, 7 different dates from Clement. You have December 25th and you have January 6th as all days that Christians recognized as the day Jesus was born. I think all of those are wrong, quite wrong actually. But there is no one set day that people actually started following up until way later because of the earliest church writings. They kind of came up with this date of the birthday of Jesus. So over time, eventually December 25th won out, but it won out based on faulty information. The reason why people think it's pagan is because in 274 AD, the Caesar Aurelian, he established a feast for the birth of Sol Invicticus, which is the unconquered sun. So Sol is the female goddess of the sun. And they had her birthday on December 25th. Well, that is kind of just happenstance. And it might actually be that Christians showed that Jesus was born on December 25th, and then the unconquered sun was a response to that to actually demean Christians. Now, interesting thing, the Barbian people and the Northern and Western Europeans also had festivals in winter around December 25th, celebrating their own gods and all these things. Now, they're not always December 25th, but there's usually always a pagan festival in this time period, no matter where you go in the European world. So that's why so many atheists and even Christians nowadays think that Christmas is just a pagan spin-off of these solar and lunar festivals. But this actually isn't the case. If you look at all of church history, you look at these writings, you might get this idea that, oh, if Christmas looks more pagan, maybe pagans would be more willing to celebrate it. So then Catholics deliberately, like they did this with rosary beads, but they took something pagan and then made it Christian. People assume that it's the same thing happening here. It's not. Actually, we get this idea of the birth of Jesus around 100 years earlier than the Festival of Sol. Now, we get this in the earliest church writings in Origen and Hippolytus of Rome. In around 200 and 220 AD, Hippolytus wrote in On the Corruption of Earth that Jesus' conception was on the same date that he died, and he believed the date that he died was on March 25th, because he believed that the creation of the universe was on March 25th. So he related the creation of the universe with the birth of Jesus. So he said, okay, well, the birth of Jesus is going to be the new creation coming. So let's just count forward 9 months. So from March 25th, add 9, you get December 25th. Even though a pregnancy is 40 weeks, it's not 9 months. So if you were to count 40 weeks, you'd get December 30th. So there's already kind of a logic that isn't being applied correctly, but they also didn't really have that, they just used 9 months as a general time frame for pregnancies. We are much more precise with the 40 weeks. And even then, term pregnancies are anywhere from 37 to 40 weeks. But either way, this is a very bad method of dating Christmas. It is what that was used, though. So both Origen and Hippolytus, and eventually Eusebius quoting them, and maybe Julius Africanus. It's kind of hard to say with Julius because almost none of his writings are preserved. But all of these church fathers were viewing March 25th as being like the traditional Easter date. And because it was the traditional Easter date, it was also the traditional conception date. And eventually that conception date was also his, you count forward 9 months, then you get his birthday. So 75 years before the creation of the Roman pagan festivals, Christians were already identifying this day as the day Jesus was conceived and then the day Jesus was born in December 25th. So the pagan festivals being established on that day might actually be an apologetic against Christianity, where Christianity was first. Rome hated Christianity, so Rome created something to mock it by having the unconquered son, showing that their gods were superior to the Christian God of Yeshua of Nazareth. So, is the day of December 25th pagan? No, it's not. Is it correct? No, it's not. There's too many issues with this. In the winter, it's too cold for shepherds to be out in the fields. So we see in the Gospel of Luke that there are shepherds living out in the fields nearby. Now, this was common practice in the summer months and in the fall months, for them to be just in the field at night, hanging out with their sheep, sleeping in the grass. This doesn't really apply much for December because it gets fairly cold in Israel in the winter. So this doesn't really fit with a December 25th time frame. There's also no mention of this event happening on December 25th specifically until way later in history. Now, we have it in mostly the earliest church writings, but it specifically being this day is a calculated day, and it doesn't actually have an established, hey, this is actually when it occurred, until you get to the 300s, when the Festival of Annunciation was already established, but it doesn't work. There's also no good reason for there to be crowds everywhere for them to be born during Hanukkah. Even if it was a census that's happening from Tiberius, even if there's these censuses happening, just because of Hanukkah and the census, you wouldn't expect it to be so overwhelmingly full. Now, if he was born on a different festival day, you would expect it to be full. And we'll get into that. But either way, this doesn't fit the timeline of Jesus' death, because it doesn't really fit the timeline of John's birth. There's two ways to calculate from the Bible the birth of Jesus, Christmas Day. The first way is to calculate from John's birth. So John, we know from Luke, John was born 6 months before Jesus. We can just read most of this passage because it's going to be important. In the time of King Herod of Judah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. They were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once Zechariah Zechariah's division was on duty. So this is the important term here. So we have the division of Abijah. Once his division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot according to the custom of the priesthood to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. This is in the holies. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembly's worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him standing at the right side of the altar of incense. This is the main chamber within the temple. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear, but the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call him John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth." I always read in a different Bible version, but I feel like the NIV is easiest to read out of, so I misquote the NIV all the time because I'm quoting the Bible version I read from, which is funny. "He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in spirit and in power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of their parents to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you do not believe my words, which came true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home, and after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord had done this to me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." And in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent an angel, Gabriel, to Mary, and Mary conceived. So we have in this that in the course of Abijah, when Zechariah was serving, that the Lord came to him through the angel Gabriel. This is a very important fact because from this fact, we actually have a timeline of when these events occurred, and this comes from 1 Chronicles 24. So it used to be that all the priests would serve in the temple at the same time, and this would cause problems after the Israelites were established and they grew in population. Once they got to a couple million people, they had so many priests that they couldn't all serve at the same time. It was just, too many cooks in the kitchen. So what David did was he split up the large number of priests and gave them appointed times in order for them to minister in the temple. Now, there were some times where the courses, all the priests served at the same time during the spring festivals, such as Passover and unleavened bread, but all the other courses, they were each a week period. So we have Jerub, Jedediah, Hereb, Sarium, Malchijah, Abijah. So we have the 8th course is Abijah. So we know that these courses are before him. These are all week periods. And we know during the spring festivals, each of them also had a thing happening. So what we can do is kind of jot this timeline down some. Nisan is the first of the year, so we get the first 8 courses plus the 2 weeks and the 3rd week for Pentecost. So this is Passover and unleavened bread and then Pentecost. So we have all of the priests serving during this point. So we have around 11 weeks or so before Zechariah was serving in the temple. And then he goes home, and in the 3rd-ish week of Sivan, he goes and he's with his wife. And I don't know, if I'm not with my wife for 2 weeks, as soon as I see her, anyway, so we can assume that immediately whenever he got home, they probably did the hanky-panky and then got pregnant. And then from there, we can count out 40 weeks, and that lands us in the middle of Nisan, around the 10th of Nisan, because this is around the 27th of Sivan. So around the 10th of Nisan, we have John being born. Well, then you can just go forward 6 months and get Jesus, which would be right in the middle or the beginning of Tishri, around Tishri 10, which is significant for a variety of reasons. Well, this isn't the only way to date it. You can date it also, instead of going forward from John's conception and his birth, and then counting 6 months, you can actually calculate backwards from Jesus' death, which is pretty cool. So Jesus started his ministry at the age of 30. Now, this is significant significant for a bunch of reasons. In the Old Testament, priests were only able to serve in ministry at the age of 30. David became king at 30. Joseph became king at 30. I believe Isaiah also began his ministry at the age of 30 in his prophethood. Instead of becoming a priest, he became a prophet. So all these things point to Jesus, starting his ministry at 30. We also have that his ministry lasted around 3.5 years. So we can get this from a couple different ways. So for Daniel 9, you get the prophecy of the sevens. And in the last seventh, the seven of the Messiah, halfway through it, in the middle of the seven, he will put an end to sacrifice at the altar. So this is a prophecy of his death, the cross. So in the middle of the seven of the Messiah preaching, he will put an end to sacrifice on the cross. So we have this. We also have, you can count around in the Gospel of John. So we have the first Passover happening in John 2, the second Passover happening in John 6, an alluded to third Passover happening around John, and we also have the final Passover happening starting in John 11 and then going through the rest of John, because Jesus was crucified during Passover. So you have 4-ish Passovers happening in John. You have the 3.5 years from Daniel, and you have David ruling for 33 years over Israel. So he ruled 40 years total, but he ruled over them combined for 33 years. So Jesus was alive for 33 years, and that he was dead and gone for 40 years, and then the destruction of the temple, which we'll get to in a second. But we have all these times where this has happened, and we even have a prophecy of the destruction of Nineveh that corresponds with the destruction of the temple, which is pretty cool. So whenever Jonah's preaching, we can actually look at the days he was preaching and the days until the destruction as the years of Jesus' ministry, because he went about the city for 3 days, and then on the start of the 4th day, so about halfway through the day, he proclaimed 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. So 40 days from the half day of that day is whenever Nineveh would be overthrown. Well, 40 years after Jesus' death in 30 AD, we have the temple being destroyed. The number 40 happens all over the Old Testament. You have the flood being 40 days, 40 nights. You have the Moses on Mount Sinai up there for 40 days. You have the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years. You have the spies mission for 40 days. You have Elijah's journey. You have Jonah's warning. You have Jesus fasting. You have the resurrection appearances lasting 40 days until Pentecost. You have the judges, kings, and leaders, a variety of places all having either 40 years, 40 days, 40 weeks, whatever in it. So like you have Othniel, Deborah, Gideon, you have King Saul, King David, King Solomon, all reigning for 40 years. You have Ezekiel's prophecy against Egypt being 40 years in Ezekiel 29. So you have all these things that represent like trials and testing and preparation and renewal and judgment and mercy, all being tied with 40, all of those tied to the destruction of 40 AD, or destruction of 70 AD, 40 years after the death of Jesus. So we can actually get a death of Jesus around 30 AD based on that. So going from 30 AD, you count backwards 33.5 years, and then you get to, Jesus died on Nisan 14. You go back half a year, that's Tishri 14. Tishri 15 is the Feast of Tabernacles. So that's significant. So you have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Feast of Tabernacles, I believe is also Sukkot, all in the same 2-week time period. And the same 2-week time period is exactly half a year before Jesus's death. And it's also 6 months after John's birth. So we have 2 different ways to make Jesus being born right around this time period. You can count backwards and you can count forwards, and you get 4 BC as the day. Well, if you look at calendar converters, you do the calculations for that, you actually end up with October 1st being the day of Jesus's birth. So right in Tishri 10, Yom Kippur, which agrees with both Nisan 10 for John, you count forward 6 months, and counting backwards from Jesus, it'd be 5 days off. Now, why Yom Kippur over the other possible festivals? So we'd say Jesus died on Passover. Jesus' death has significant meaning for Passover. He is the Passover lamb. He is the one that takes away the sin of the world. He is the one that brings us out of bondage and slavery. And then in the unleavened bread, whenever he's buried, he goes into a virgin tomb. He goes into a sinless tomb. There's never been death in that tomb. He's never had death in his flesh. So the festival of unleavened bread celebrates the the unleavened bread, the sinless bread being taken in by the people, and we have the sinless Lamb of God being sent into the tomb for 3 days. And then halfway through the week of unleavened bread, he resurrects. And right around that time, you have the Feast of the First Fruits here, which is the exact day, likely, Jesus resurrected. So we have the first fruits representing the resurrection from the dead. Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, which we get all over Scripture. So Jesus' resurrection, his death, and his burial all fulfill some aspect of a feast, which I'm going to do a video just on the feasts themselves and how Jesus represents it. And then Pentecost comes, and the Feast of Weeks comes, and the Holy Spirit, who's promised 50 days after, comes, and he fills the people. And so there is all 4 of these are fulfilled in meaningful ways by the death of Jesus. So it would make sense that the other 4 important ones would be fulfilled in the birth of Jesus, which is really cool to go over. So, how does each of these things relate to the birth of Jesus? Rosh Hashanah is the creation of the world. It's also called the Feast of Trumpets. So there's this loud trumpet call happening whenever Rosh Hashanah starts. Rosh Hashanah marks the new year in the civil calendar. The first of Nisan is the new year in the actual calendar, but in the civil calendar, Rosh Hashanah is the first of the year. Jesus coming into being physically here represents the new creation coming. So in the same way that the church fathers believe that March 25th was the day of creation, the Jews believe Rosh Hashanah is the day of creation, and Jesus came during the day of creation. So rather than being conceived in the day of creation, he is born on the day of creation. Yom Kippur is the High Holy Day. It's the day when all sin is forgiven, when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and gives forgiveness for the world. And what does Jesus do? Well, he's our high priest. He's going into the Holy of Holies. He's going into heaven, and he is advocating for us directly before the Father in the courtroom of heaven with his blood. So rather than carrying the bloods of bulls that can only partially take away sin and the guilt of sin, Jesus carries his own blood into the Holy of Holies before the courtroom of heaven and pronounces us clean through it. So Yom Kippur has extreme significance for the birth of Jesus, which is likely why it was Yom Kippur. So we have Passover and Yom Kippur, the 2 most important days in the Jewish festivals, and Jesus died on one and was born on the other. And then we have the Feast of Tabernacles, which would have been ending right around the same day that Jesus would have been circumcised and then presented to the world. So his circumcision on the 8th day is corresponding with the Feast of Tabernacles, where Jesus is tabernacling within us, around us. We have in John 1, the tabernacles, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And in the same way, at the end of Revelation, God in the new earth will tabernacle with us. Dwell with them is another way of saying to tabernacle with. So we have God entering into reality, entering into the incarnation, into human flesh. And we have a Feast of Trumpets, which singles in, it's the coming of the angels. The angels come and they play trumpets whenever Jesus is born. So we have Rosh Hashanah being there. We have Yom Kippur, this holy sacrifice, the taking away of sins of the world. And the Feast of Tabernacles celebrating God dwelling with us physically, which is just so cool. Oh, this also likely will correspond to Jesus' return as well, because we have that the Lord himself will come back down from heaven with a loud command and a voice of an archangel and a loud trumpet call. So this is the same trumpet, this is shofar. This is the same trumpet that you would expect to see in Rosh Hashanah, in the Feast of Trumpets. So we have a trumpet call singling in the return of Jesus. And again, in 1 Corinthians, we have that whenever he comes, we will be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So we have trumpets announcing the return of Jesus, just as we had trumpets announcing the birth of Jesus, which is really cool. The interesting thing about him being born on Yom Kippur is that would make his conception day Hanukkah, which in 5 BC was December 25th. So, ironically, it's maybe not ironic, maybe God planned this all out. Where's all pawns in his game? Hanukkah is December 25th in the year Jesus was conceived. Why is that significant? Well, one, if you celebrate December 25th as the coming of God incarnate, you're still kind of right. The conception day, life begins at conception. The conception day is December 25th. So you still have Jesus being celebrated as his life coming into the world on December 25th. So in a way, Christmas is kind of right. It's just not the birth of Jesus we're celebrating, it's his conception. What's interesting about Hanukkah is it's the festival of lights. So what Hanukkah is about is whenever the Maccabean War was happening, they didn't have any oil to keep the lights in the temple burning, so it was supernaturally provided by God. The lights were on in the temple. God's presence was holy and was in the temple. It was brought back into the temple when there was an absence for a long time. So by Jesus being conceived at this moment, God re-entered the world after 500 years of silence and of abandoning his people. He entered back. And he brought the light into the world because Jesus himself is the light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world. Awesome. That's pretty cool. So all this meaning, all this purpose, Jesus fulfills the spring and fall festivals and Hanukkah. So all festivals of Judaism, Jesus' conception, birth, and death fulfill them in very specific ways. So this is not something superficial. It's not something offhanded. God deliberately planned all of this. And he planned it in a way that is so beautiful and so amazing that I can't even fully comprehend the depth and the beauty of it. So there you go. Christmas, not technically December 25th. His conception is December 25th. His birthday is October 1st. But really his birthday would be Tishri 10. So you'd have to go off the Jewish if you wanted to be fully accurate. Yeah, it's not pagan. Rome didn't invent the Christmas day. It was invented well before then. And we have a reason to believe that December 25th does have purpose from even before the birth of Jesus. So Merry Christmas. I hope you have a wonderful day spending time with your family. Yeah. I'm good.